Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first live session inaugurating the First World Energy Forum. This conference has been organized by MDPI Energies Journal, and the University of Sapienza. I would like to say thank you also to all of our sponsors, partnering societies, and media partners, and all the participants for joining us today. During September and until the 4th of October, you can read and comment all the author submissions presented for the conference, and also enjoy some recorded and live sessions. Please look at our webpage for more information. The chair for this first live session is Professor Roberto Melli from the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering from Sapienza University of Rome. This session will have Dr. Caro as the main speaker. We will also have a final discussion and a Q&A session moderated by Professor Melli. So if you have any question, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box. I would also like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and that we also have a YouTube live streaming today. These recordings will be posted on the webinar webpage for everyone to watch it as soon as possible. So now I will hand out the microphone to Professor Melli. So thank you very much for accepting to chair this session, and everyone enjoy.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon everyone attending this video conference, and welcome to the first presentation of the First World Energy Forum, which was supposed to be held in Rome. Then COVID-19 forced us to cancel and make it as a video conference. Today's presentation is about legal implication in energy production and distribution, and the speaker is Dr. Caro, who works for an important attorney law firm whose core business is energy in all its facets. And I'm sure he himself will go into details how to explain how they work. I think everything has been said also about questions. So Frank, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, good morning and thank you, Dr. Roberto Melli. My name is Caro. Let's start with slide 1, please. Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the First World Energies Forum conference. It's morning here in the United States. I'm sitting in the middle of the country. And so you go to the next slide, Sean. In a little bit about me, I chair the energy practice group of this large law firm in the United States with offices. Sean, go to the next slide. Across the country, this shows you a map of the areas across the country where we've done renewable energy. Our office is based in the middle. Sean, a little bit of a slide presentation on the middle of the country, right there in Kansas City and St. Louis. So smack dab in the middle of the United States is where our offices are. And all of the pins on the map have offices, our 22 offices from coast to coast across the country. And we'll get into more details later on in this presentation about the significance of our offices in basically the middle of the United States in the renewable energy aspects, in the transformation we see going on in energy across the world. So on to the next slide, Sean. And I also want to recognize Sean Pluta. Sean is my associate who sits in our St. Louis office. I'm in our Kansas City headquarters office. So let's talk about what we want to talk about this morning. And this is going to take about an hour, and I'll leave hopefully some time, although we have a number of slides to get through, for some questions later on. So we want to talk about these discussion topics, and in order to talk about a World Energy Conference and we would love to have been there in Roma with you to do this, but instead we're hunkered down in our individual offices, and we mask up and we're taking precaution, and hopefully everyone's safe. Things have not gotten back to normal in the US, as they, I'm sure, haven't gotten back to normal in Europe or anywhere else in the world. We want to talk about the history of the EU energy policy, what's been going on, how it's transformed, 20 and 30, 50 targets, the energy mix, carbon capture, and its successes and maybe opportunities there, if any. Some case study of Germany, and we looked at Germany because of it's the largest industrial nation in the EU. And then some comparisons to the US, because, you know, we're not alone, you're not alone, we're one global economy, and we're all seeing the same things. You may be seeing a little bit ahead of us, or we may be lagging behind, but a lot of that is based on the next topic, politics, and the politics of energy. There was just a big article in the Wall Street Journal over this weekend about who's going to lead in the future in the world energy politics, and the emphasis seemed to be on China. And then the next aspect is integrated resource plans, and how the US is looking towards the future and has been on planning. That doesn't mean they have the crystal ball, they don't. And that's what we're all searching for here. Next slide, let's start with recent history of the energy policy in the EU. We look at the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007, the targets and the goals of that to fight climate change and the climate change aspects going on. So instead of the traditional carbon-based production of energy, production of electricity through carbon-based resources, coal, fuel oil, natural gas, and burning of fuel stock, we're looking at this transformation to carbon. Look at the key targets and goals: 40% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions from the 1990 levels, 32% share in renewable energy, an increase there, and a 32.5% improvement in energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. That's the thing that we can do pretty quickly and easily without spending a lot of money to save on carbon and to save on energy usage. Then we go to the Paris Agreement between 55 countries, including the EU, and what its goals were to curb global temperature rise between 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrials, includes global transparency in energy use. So everyone's become more aware now on energy use. And then the European Green Deal in 2019 and 2020, net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It's an aggressive goal, 50 to 55% cut in emissions by 2030. On to the next slide, Sean. And so now we'll look at how have we done in what's your energy consumption in the EU at the time right now. And you look at from 1990 all the way to 2018 and 2019, and you can see, obviously there's a big increase in renewables, the red, the third bar up. Sean, if you can show the third bar up, the first one being oil, the second one gas. Oil has decreased, the gas has stayed pretty much the same throughout. It's kind of the hedge fuel between heavily carbon-based oil and coal. And then the next one up is coal. It's decreased a bit, and then nuclear power up above there. Renewables seem to be up at the very top, that blue line. Next slide. Here's a graph that shows kind of how much the carbon emissions fell by more than 20% in the last, 30 years, 28 years. And it's fallen pretty well. I mean, there was a rise you see in that 08 period of time, around 2010, dropped down, and it's risen a little bit. But it's, in all, I think it's on track on what we wanted to track, at least in the EU. Let's look ahead now, and let's look at the 2030 timeframe on what's the framework for climate and energy and the targets. We're looking at 2020 greenhouse gas emissions down 20%. And, 2030, it's pretty aggressive in the next 10 years to be down to 40%, to double in the next 10 years. Renewable energy is up 20% across the EU right now. The aggressive goal is to move that to 32. Energy efficiency, again, what I said, what was the initial low-hanging fruit has increased efficiencies, and those are up 20%. And 32.5 in 2030. Interconnections, that's transmission. How is your grid in the EU interconnected? How are you all interconnected so that you can see later we can bring, some solar development up from Spain and other countries up into Germany and vice versa, and how are we all tied together? Unlike the United States, even though we're 50 different states independently run, we have the same national policy. The European Union's supposed to bring that unified national policy together with all the countries that are members of the EU. And so how are you sharing energy production amongst yourselves in the states that may not have renewable resources to reduce their carbon footprint? The climate funded programs, these are awareness and studies that are being done in the US to cut carbon, and then also other sources like transportation, long haul trucking, things like that. How are they doing in those cuts? Next slide. This pretty quickly just shows you that you're pretty much on track to 20 by 20, a 20% reduction in carbon-based by 2020. Like I said, it's a pretty aggressive goal in the next 10 years to nearly double that. Next slide. It shows you individually which countries are in their places. So if you look at, let's look at Italy, because, the conference is based out of Italy. So we see where Italy stands, and they're not quite there, but, within their 2020 target, because the 2020 target was the entire EU. You look at Sweden on the opposite end, and in how far they've advanced above their target and kind of setting the pace. And then you look at the industrial countries they're all in a row, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, and how they're moving towards that. I was just in Amsterdam last year, and we only spent 2 days there before we headed into Africa for a solar project we were working on. And, I was amazed that every taxi at the airport was a Tesla, an electric vehicle. So we don't see that here in the US. Next slide. So this looks at your generation portfolio. So one of the biggest carbon emitters is obviously electric generation use. So, we're looking at generation portfolio, 20% of energy is used, from renewable resources in Europe right now. It's grown quite a bit, nearly doubled in the last 14 years. Can it double again? I think it can. You're seeing costs of energy going way down for renewables. The problem is going to be resources and what the European Union's resources have been. Next bullet point shows the quantity of electricity generated, go back, Sean, in the EU from solar and wind is 15.5 times and 2.9 times as high as it was in 2018 from 2008. So great strides are being made there. And you can see there on the slide of the most industrialized countries and their usage and goals towards that. Next slide. Again, kind of closer look at renewables and the energy mix by country there. Again, if you look at Estonia on top with as much coal as they're burning, and the black is coal, and the orange is oil. The next would be natural gas in yellow. And so, if we look at, we look at Denmark again, not very much coal in its generation mix, but a lot of green and renewables. You look down below and you look at France on the bottom. Not much coal, but look at its nuclear resource. That's the red or maroon color down there. You look at Italy. A bit of coal, mostly natural gas production in there, some mix of renewables, and then some hydro. You look down at Austria, again, a lot of hydro there in the blue. So again, still another renewable resource, but not something that's being developed much anymore, at least not in the United States. I don't know how it's being developed in the EU countries, but we haven't seen a lot of new hydro being done, only because of the environmental aspects of putting on new hydro. Next slide. So if we need to have this transformation, where's the transformation coming from in energy? And it seems to be coming from the renewables side. It's the easiest one. And so now we're looking at, what's your solar array look like? What's your solar resource look like in Europe? And so this shows you, obviously red is a higher solar and better solar, so you get more use of the sun. And if you look at Southern Europe, Spain, Southern Italy, into Greece, better sun. The yellow is really pretty good, too, in that area. So, and then you look at where all the solar facilities are. Those are the dots down in the second slide, down below there. We don't see much in the Scandinavian countries up there, but you see a few in England, in the United Kingdom, but a lot in Germany, a lot in Spain, a lot in Italy, and Eastern Europe, some in France. And we're going to look at this from the United States perspective too. So we'll show you the resource allocations and where things are coming in. Again, the three big areas being solar, wind, and hydro. And again, not much hydro going on. Next slide will show you the wind resource. And again, the better wind in the green. So Northern Europe, sub-Scandinavian countries, in Germany, Great Britain, Southern Europe, not so much. So not a great wind resource there. Again, look at all the blue dots there, and you can see the accumulation of wind farms across. One thing Europe's done a great thing with is offshore wind. There's quite a bit more offshore wind there. The US has nearly zero so far. Now they have a lot planned, but quite a bit of offshore wind in the North Sea, and I've seen stories about that. One of the biggest developers of wind in the US is Enel, the big national utility in Italy, and big developer of wind across the US. and globally. Next slide. So let's look at what the current energy policy goals are and requirements in the EU right now. And so we're looking at, under the regulation of the governance of European Union and climate action, member states are required to submit a 10-year integrated national energy and climate plan. And for the periods of 2021 to 2030. And I haven't delved into them except to look at, these are what they hope to accomplish. In the United States, we have what's called the integrated resource plans. And I believe there's about 32 states in the US and growing that have enacted that these states adopt integrated resource plans for their utilities. So in the European Union, the integrated energy plans are to cover these topics. They're long-term strategies going out for 10 years involving energy efficiency. What are your goals? How are you going to get there? Renewables, what are your goals? How are you going to get there? How are you going to cut greenhouse gas emissions? What other emission reductions are you doing? Are you retrofitting coal plants? Are you retrofitting gas plants? Are you looking at carbon capture? How are you taking the carbon out of those facilities and what are you doing with it? Storage of that. Interconnections, how are we sharing? How are we creating a grid and sharing within the EU nations the resources that we have for renewables, whether it's wind from the north and sun from the south? And how are we tying this all together with transmission facilities? And with older nations and things like that, it's hard to look at transmission corridors. It may be gas pipelines too, because gas is a smaller emitter of carbon than oil or coal is right now. And then research and innovation. How are we getting better? How are we planning? How are you engineers? And I assume most of the people on this call are going to be in this conference are engineers. How are you putting on your thinking caps in solving these problems? I have a number of engineers in my family, and it seems like they can solve any problem if you just give them a little bit of, as they say, they just do the math. As a lawyer, we don't know anything about the math, so. And then what we'll show later is how does this compare with the US integrated resource plans? Next slide, just real briefly, these are the major players in the, energy ecosystem across Europe. Governments, member-owned companies, state-owned and private utilities, clean energy companies, a lot of these, Siemens, Vestas, NL, NG, big, huge players in the United States in clean energy. They have billions of dollars of investment in the US in clean, and not only in the US, but across the world in clean energy. Next slide. So once we get to all that, what's this going to cost us? For so long, we always heard it was cheaper to burn coal and it was cheaper. And what's it going to cost consumers? Well, with technology and research and investment, the cost of renewables has really plummeted. I mean, here's wind, and this is a study done by Lazard. I don't know if, I think it's across the world, but I know it's definitely US based on that. And even that low end wind, if you have a great wind resource in the United States, like we do in central part of the United States, where we're seeing wind capacities of about 60%. And you're seeing wind being sold at sub $20 range. And it's, it just keeps going down. The problem with these large wind farms is, what does it cost to bring the wind to the market? It's what's our transmission issues. You don't have that with solar. And you're seeing solar prices drop significantly on solar panels. and photovoltaic, and the research and the technology, the production in China, and the drop of those costs have been significant, which has allowed solar to drop. And the issue about solar is it's a distributed generation. So that means you can locate it and co-locate it on the facility, whether it's rooftop, whether it's a solar farm, you know, whatever the case may be, you can put it closer to the grid so you're not spending, you know, $1 million a mile to build transmission to bring wind into the grid. And so it's a great resource. We're seeing a great transformation of solar throughout. Here's a little bit of next slide, just briefly about, you know, kind of the cost of, you know, of your power, because it's one thing to have these goals and ideas, but what's it going to cost us? And are we gonna, if we have to shut down or transform these carbon emitted, you know, resources that have already been paid for, these coal plants that have already been paid for, or these natural gas facilities or the oil facilities, and we have to shut them down. And how are we going to pay for these new resources? So this is about the cost in there, you know, and you're looking at, you know, the average cost in the, you know, it's not that, I thought it was different, but the average cost across the EU for households is not much different. In the US, the equivalent in euros is about 12 cents for consumers. And for business, it's about 11 cents is the average cost. So, you know, a little bit higher in the EU, but, you know, not so much so. Next issue I want to talk about is, are there alternatives? Can we utilize the facilities we have that are producing energy right now? And we know we have these mandates, but how do we deal with the carbon emissions in there? So, you know, one aspect has been carbon capture and storage. Right now, and I don't know, there's about 5 carbon capture and storage facilities in the UK, 2 in Norway, 1 in the Netherlands. There might be updates you might have on others that are going on. And I know that in the US, there's a carbon capture and storage facility just here in Kansas, in the central part of the country, where we're taking an ethanol facility. They're producing ethanol from corn and grain, which is an additive to gasoline to power vehicles. And they're taking the carbon that's emitted from the production of ethanol and transporting it by pipeline and using it for enhanced oil recovery, where they pump it into the field and it moves the hydrocarbons up so they can produce more oil. Again, next slide. The principal barriers for carbon capture and storage are high investment and operational costs. You know, the market for carbon capture, you know, in the US, we're seeing it for enhanced oil. There may be other aspects of that. The lack of transportation, again, in the US, we're using pipelines to transport it, you know, and the cost and storage aspects of it. The fourth one is, it's really not a widely known and embraced by the general public. I'm an energy lawyer, so, you know, we've heard a lot about it, but again, the general public doesn't realize about it. And then the environmental risk. Once it's put into these caverns, these abandoned salt caverns, these abandoned gas facilities, is it going to stay in there? And if so, what, if anything, is it going to do once you pump it in there? Is it to other, like water pollution or anything else that's perceived to be an issue? We haven't seen any of that in the US, so hopefully that's not an issue. Next slide. Let's look at Germany. So we did a kind of a case study, so we kind of see where's Germany been in its movement towards renewables. And over the last 30 years, they've marked a transition in energy sourcing. You know, they had a big nuclear fleet and they were moving towards more of a nuclear fleet, but Chernobyl came around in 1986, which kind of changed a little bit of the government policies on that. So no new reactors were constructed after the accident. Then in 2002, there was some aspects to phase out nuclear. Then in 2010, there was a debate about, you know, looking at phasing out all of everyone. And this was after Fukushima. Fukushima came along and it changed everyone, even the US. There was a resurgence in nuclear in the US. There hadn't been a new nuclear plant built in 20 years. And then Tennessee Valley Authority built one in Tennessee. And that came online in 2016. But I tell you, Fukushima, changed everything. It changed the dynamics of nuclear. It changed it in Germany. It changed it across the world, except for, I think, France. I think France is still, you know, all in on nuclear. Next slide. Their goals. In Germany, fight climate change, phase out nuclear power, improve energy security through a reduction in fossil fuels. They don't have to import natural gas or coal or anything else that they don't have in their country. And then guaranteeing industrial competitiveness and growth. So price is a big factor, and it's a factor for everyone to consider. The energy targets in Germany. Next slide, Sean. Phase out the nuclear plants by 22, transform the energy system to renewable energy, minimum 80% of gross electricity consumption through renewables, and enhance energy efficiency to reduce emissions 80 to 95%. I tell you, when I was in Europe, there's so much more energy efficiency going on there than there is in the US. And I think cost drives that price down. As costs rise, people start conserving more and they start becoming more innovative, and the engineers design more systems that use less electricity. Next thing that Germany did, next slide, is the feed-in tariff. So what they did is part of their renewable energy sources, they've enacted a standard offer contract that pays for a qualifying energy producer at a fixed rate to produce electricity and deliver it into Germany. Initially, because they had to kickstart the project, the feed-in tariffs, it was above market to encourage people to do that. And it can, I guess the feed-in tariff means you're going to pay a price, and if you can deliver power below or at that price, then you can sell into the market and the utilities will buy your renewable energy resource. Again, next slide. Again, this goes through the aspects of the program. Stats a fixed term for payments, usually a 20-year contract so that people can recoup, developers can recoup their investment. It removes the utility monopoly on generating power in the US. Still, in the majority of United States you got vertically integrated utilities that own the production, the power plants, the transmission lines, and the distribution facilities. This takes the production of power out of it and shares the burden of costs. So this is the next slide, shows the impact of these on the average power prices. Now they've risen over these 13 years, but if you look at some of them, some of the bigger costs, and that has been transmission over a period of time, and the blue matter being renewable energy surcharge. So it's risen, but they're getting the effect in achieving their carbon goals. Again, let's look at the next slide. Let's see, what impact has it had on renewables? And if you look here, renewables have increased significantly over these 28 years. And nuclear power has decreased, and coal, which is the hard coal and lignite, those and big carbon emitters have had pretty good reductions. Gas pretty much stayed the same. Next slide. So now let's look at how does this compare with what's going on in the US. And the first thing we look at is energy infrastructure. Let's compare the EU to the US. And if we look at that, I was kind of surprised that the US at the top has as much petroleum products that they're using to produce electricity. Natural gas doesn't surprise me because we have an abundance of natural gas due to fracking issues and an abundance of natural gas. The solid fossil fuels, this is coal. Again, I thought that there was more coal use in the US than that, so it surprised me. Pretty much on par, Europe and the US, you know, it's the only really big difference would be the natural gas side. Nuclear energy, obviously the EU with France has got a lot more nuclear power than the US does, only 8%, and that 8% seems to be dropping slightly as nuclear plants are becoming retired. They're more than 30 years or 40 years in age in the US. Next slide. Here's a comparison of renewable energy comparisons in the US to the EU. Again, my big shock was wood is as high as it is. Probably the Pacific Northwest and probably the two corners of the US, you know, the Northeast and the Northwest, big wood producers there. You know, pretty much everything's the same. Wind is only 23% versus 34% in the EU. So again, a big thing. We have a big dependence on coal in the US, and you'll see it in the next slide. Sean, the next slide. Next slide shows us, okay, these are the top 25 largest states by population in how they're being sourced as far as power. So if you look at California, which claims to be the greenest state out there, and you know, it's got a zero carbon by 2050 basis, and you look at, you know, green being renewables, coal being the brown, and yellow being nuclear there. Then you look at Washington in the middle, the state of Washington, 76.9% in renewables. A lot of that has to do to hydro. So it's not like they got a big wind resource or solar resource there. It's a lot of it's hydro, a bit of coal and some nuclear. You go to a state like Colorado that claims to be another green state, but you see that Colorado is sitting there with 78.1% of coal. It's because of where it's located. The big Powder River Basin coal mines are just north of Colorado, the next state north in Wyoming. So, you know, things are different there, and you'll see those changes there. Hopefully these are all. Colorado is another one that's governor has said we want to go to zero carbon by 2050. Missouri, where we're located, is right there, 82.9% coal production. So they got a long ways to go. They got a little bit of wind resource, but only 4.1%. Another big coal state would be Indiana over there. And they're, you know, 94.6%. So, you know, Ohio, another big coal state. Florida, unfortunately, they have a great solar resource there. The biggest, you know, renewable generator in the world is NextEra. They're based out of Florida, and that's I'm sure they're moving quickly to change that. Let's go back. Next slide, Sean. So now we talk about the regional variations within the US and how things are progressing. So we look at solar and where, you know, the solar facilities are, and they're focused on the East Coast because they don't have any wind resource there. They're focused on the Southwest in California, where there's, you know, it's hot. You know, Phoenix gets to 120 degrees with a lot of sun, no shade. Then you look at the middle of the country, which is the wind parts. That's where we are. And you'll see another slide that shows those aspects of it. And then hydro, again, no new hydro being developed. They're very rare anymore. Again, it's on the wet side. It's on the East Coast, and it's in the Northwest. Next slide. This shows you the solar resources within the US, and it does a comparison to Germany. So you can see that, you know, even though Germany's got a lot of, is putting in solar up there, you know, their solar resources not near as good as parts of the US. We're sitting right here in Kansas City and in St. Louis. Sean will show you those on the map. So right there on the edge of that. Next map. This shows your wind resource. These are the windiest parts of the US, and you see them. The number one windiest state pursuant to the National Renewable Energy Lab is in the US is Texas. Number two is Kansas, where that white line is going through, and I'll explain what that is. And then three, I believe, is South Dakota. But the number one producing state in the US for wind resource is Texas. Number two is Iowa. Number three is California. And number four is Kansas. So we're sitting right there. Let me show you a little bit about this white line that goes in there. That's a major transmission project that's going on. There's a few major transmission projects, and we talked about how do we join the grids together? How do we join so that we're taking the wind resource in central US and bringing it to the East Coast? Well, this transmission line is a 600 kV HVDC, high voltage direct current line. That's a $9 billion project that will move 4,000 megawatts of wind from the windiest parts of Southwest Kansas over across Missouri, across Indiana, across Illinois and into Indiana. The significance of Indiana is 680-mile transmission line, very big line, 130 to 150 feet high, 40 by 40 lattice base. So it's a very, very big project. It'll run across the farmlands of Kansas and Missouri and Illinois and into Indiana. The Indiana, why that's important, because you have three electric grids. The central part of the US is the Southwest Power Pool. To the east is MISO Power Pool. And then in Indiana, it's PJM. And once you get into the PJM grid, these are the electrical grids that divide the US. They can move power up into New York, New Jersey, and the East Coast, Pennsylvania, and all those places where they have little or no wind resource, except for looking at the map on the offshore side. And again, we have literally no offshore wind, so to speak, yet. There's another project that starts in Wyoming and moves through a corner of Colorado. Sean, if you can point out Wyoming, and then ends up in Las Vegas, down in the point down there in Las Vegas. And so that'll bring, again, it's a 600-mile line, again, bringing lots of wind from windy Wyoming into Las Vegas and into California. Other players in the US. And so, you know, in the US, we have kind of a threefold. Next slide, Sean. You have public utilities, and there's two types. They're investor-owned. That means they're publicly traded stock companies that are produced that serve most of the U.S. in the larger cities. There are privately owned utilities governed and regulated the same way as investor-owned. There are cooperatives that are member-owned, usually serving in rural areas. It was developed in the 20s and 30s so they could serve rural areas because the cost to serve in rural areas is a lot higher. They get some U.S. backed federal money to help pay for the loans on those, but pretty independent. Then there's public power. Public power are city-owned utilities. There's quite a few across the U.S. In the state that I live in Kansas, we probably have over 120 small municipalities that are public power entities. They use bonds and issue bonds and taxes and things like that. Two organizations that play a big role. There's really more than that, but the American Public Power Association and the National Rural Electric Co-op Association, both based in Washington, D.C., both lobby Congress for funding and things for investments. Recent U.S. climate policy. Again, we're running out of time, but I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You've seen us withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, from our sitting president, repealing the Clean Power Plan, which was an President Obama-based plan, slowing of energy project approvals at the federal level, but there's not a lot of projects that get done on the federal level in the U.S. Most have been done on private property, and you're building big wind farms, you're building big solar facilities, and you're negotiating with landowners to get access to their land and lease their land and put projects in place. A general preference for oil, gas, and coal. That might be the case in Washington, but that's not the case with the U.S., with large U.S. businesses, like Microsoft, like Google, like the big tech companies. They all like green. They all like green sells in the U.S. And so to be, the Budweiser, owned by a European company, InBev, they've gone completely 100% green in their facilities. They're based in St. Louis, Missouri, where Sean's sitting. Focusing on protectionist energy policies. Yeah, they take this position of all of the above energy policy. So everything's being done, but most of the big investor-owned utilities in the U.S., these are the stock traded companies. If they're getting funds from, like say, pension funds across the U.S., those pension funds are driving these big businesses to convert from these big coal facilities to more renewables. And so most major utilities across the United States are moving towards renewable. And let's move on to the next slide. Well, this is our current president. And if he gets reelected, what can we expect? Probably more of the same, kind of all of the above. I think he's realized that we've shuttered a lot of coal plants here in the U.S. and we're on the precipice for retiring a lot of coal plants in the U.S. And so you'll see more retirements and transitions away from coal in the U.S. But there's still a lot of jobs associated with energy, whether it's drilling for oil, whether it's natural gas, whether it's coal mines and things like that. So he's trying to manage to some extent that transition away from that. How does that compare to the other candidate for the U.S. for running in the next few weeks? And that's Joe Biden. He's taken on this 100%, what we call the Green New Deal, and 100% clean energy economy reaches net zero emissions by 2050. That seems to be catching on. It caught on first in Europe. It's catching on in the US. A number of states across the US have moved towards that. States like California, Colorado, others, I believe Minnesota, their governors moving towards that. The New England states, Massachusetts, Vermont definitely is moving towards that place. You know, federal investment over 1.7 trillion over the next 10 years. You know, we'll probably have to do more than that to move that forward. You know, requiring public companies disclose climate risks. You know, and you know, you're seeing a lot of that. So these big pension funds are saying we don't want, we're not going to invest in companies that are not moving towards a greener economy. And like I said, from a business perspective, green sells. You know, all the big data companies, all the big technology companies, they're all moving towards that. Next slide. In the US, like the EU, you have independent countries in the EU, we have independent states. All 50 states are independent, but they do come under a national scheme of regulation. And so each state has its Public Utility Commission, which regulates utilities and the operation of utilities in those states. Those state mindsets are different. There's, you know, 24 states have joined the US Climate Alliance, which is, you know, supporting the Paris Agreement. And you can see the breakdown of those states. I mean, I'm going to cut to the chase. They're pretty much all Democratic states. So we have two-party system, the Republicans and the Democrats. Pretty much all of the Democrat states are in green and are outlined, and pretty much all of the, what we call the red states would be all Republican states. Now that doesn't mean the states in gray aren't following and not moving towards renewables, because, you know, they are. I know Kansas, for instance, where I live, is moving towards renewables, and they're doing it not on a mandate basis, but on a it's good for business basis. And we're producing a lot of wind in Kansas, so it makes sense. Also, you know, some of those states in gray, Sean, point to Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana are big coal producing states too. So there's a lot of jobs in coal mining. West Virginia. Renewable portfolio standards. Next slide, Sean. So across the US, there are 38 states that have adopted renewable portfolio standards. And so most of those are 20% renewables by 2020, with a move towards 30 by 2030. And some states are going to, you know, 100% or zero carbon, net zero carbon by 2050. This is a mechanism just like the European mechanism on how do you evaluate the systems that utilities have to determine whether there's a measured approach towards power production. In other words, we don't want to overbuild and put more coal plants and more natural gas plants and more nuclear plants online if we don't need it. So back in, I want to say in the late 90s, the US came to an understanding that a number of states adopted integrated resource plans, and they were a mechanism for utilities and utility commissions in 32 different states to measure how are you growing, how you're meeting your demand, and how you're meeting it with efficient and sufficient service. Efficient meaning is the cost that you're paying the lowest possible cost, so the least cost possible to generate power. And sufficient meaning, are you producing enough electricity to meet all the demand? And so these programs look at load forecasts, they look at fuel prices, they look at capital costs, they look at conditions in the electricity market. You know, energy efficiency in the 90s wasn't a big thing. Now it's a bigger thing and it's slimming down. So it's impacting load forecasts. We had up until 2008 in the crash in 2008, we had load growth of 3% a year across the US. In general, some states like California, Florida, Arizona, Texas, we're growing even more rapidly than that. And so how are we going to catch up with the demand? And so this is what an integrated resource plan did. It allowed the utility to plan into the future, to have people come in and get involved in these proceedings, whether it was the Sierra Club, who was trying to limit the growth of carbon-based energy production and more renewables, or it was industrial users of power saying we need more power because we want to expand our facilities, and because of that we need more power. So it brought all those together. It also brought the consumers together. If you and I are paying higher electric rates, why are we doing so, and how do we look at that going into the future? So here's an example, looking at what St. Louis did, and again, load analysis, load forecasting, supply-side resources, transmission distribution analysis, demand-side resources. If we have two things, we can do energy efficiency and you can do demand-side resources. Can you co-locate a distributed generation facility at a plant so that during your building to meet your peak in demand, if the peak goes to 120 degrees and you don't have enough power to serve, you can take those industrial facilities, bring them offline, and they can produce their own power. So it's demand side resources, which are less efficient, but less costly to consumers. Again, resource acquisition strategies, and then filing schedules. And I'm going to skip through the next piece because I want to get to questions if we have time. But this talks about, Ameren, which is the big electric utility sitting in St. Louis that serves both Missouri and into Illinois, and what they've been doing, and people can look through that later. So with that, I've kind of moved through all of this, but kind of did a little bit of a, but not real granular comparison of the EU's energy system and the US energy system. So I'd stand for any questions. Professor Melli, if we have.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Yes, I see a couple of questions. Georgi Dumitrescu, sorry. What do you mean by net zero carbon emission, and how to reach this target?
Yeah, so net zero means that if there's always going to be, we're going to have carbon emissions. We're not going to get rid of zero carbon emissions, but because you're going to need resources like a natural gas facility that's going to, even if you had 100% renewables, if you could meet your demand, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. And so you need to either, whether it's battery storage or it's natural gas, you're going to have a carbon emission. So your net zero means you between what you're taking out of the system and what you're putting in, you're zeroing out to net zero.
He also asked, the 2050 energy efficiency seems to be very ambitious. This aim implies expensive retrofitting of old actual energy technologies or new ones based almost on solar energy.
Yes, it does. It is efficient. We've made, and one would say that we've already made the strides we're going to make in energy efficiency, and there's nowhere else to go. But we offer it to the engineers to come up with the solutions, to make the system that, produces a furnace or produces an air conditioner that is more energy efficient and does things differently. And so we're looking to technology to drive that next level out there. In the US, we haven't even scratched the surfaces of it. We have a lot of area, a lot of old buildings, a lot of, not near as old as Europe, but what we're doing is we called a system called PACE, P-A-C-E, Property Assessed Clean Energy. It's a mechanism by which cities can offer bonds for people to retrofit their homes to put renewable energy products, whether it's solar on the roof, whether it's better insulation, whether it's more efficient appliances, those type of things to do that. And it's you know, it's a loan program, so to speak, to do that. And I think Europe's already done those type of things.
Okay, seems that there are no more questions. Thank you, Frank. It was very interesting. Quantifying those numbers is very important, particularly for decision making, I think, where we want to guide our choices in energy solution.
There are a lot of factors coming into energy. It's like it's politics, it's price, it's transition, and we're in this transformative transition mode right now. And technology
Yes.
change. So thank you for allowing me to be here, and thank you, Sean, for assisting, and Dr. Melli. I hope you have a fantastic conference, and I wish I could be there in person with all of you, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you very much. Thank everybody for attending this video conference, and we will see each other in a week, I suppose. Until then, so long. Bye. Ciao.
Arrivederci.
Bye, everyone.
Arrivederci.
Thank you for the talk and everything.